My friends, let me begin with a question that should shake us out of our comfortable assumptions. What happens when two great powers, one rising, one clinging to its dominance, collide? Not directly, but in the contested spaces of nations caught in the middle. That is precisely the question before us today when we ask whether China will defend Venezuela and what a U.S. military clash in that region could really mean. Do not be fooled. This is not merely about Venezuela. It is about a much larger struggle, one that defines the trajectory of the 21st century, the decline of an empire, and the emergence of another. When we look at history with clear and honest eyes, a sobering reality emerges. Empires do not step down quietly. They rarely accept the fading of their dominance with dignity. Instead, they thrash, they resist, they cling to their power with desperate energy, often dragging millions into needless wars and conflicts in the process. Rome expanded until its armies could no longer defend the vastness of its conquests. Britain stretched itself across the globe until it was hollowed out economically and forced to hand over its colonies. The Soviet Union poured its resources into a global rivalry until its own internal contradictions brought it crashing down. And now, the United States faces that same historic turning point. The question is not whether decline is occurring. It is how the nation will respond to it. Will it channel its resources into endless wars, trying to maintain a global dominance that is slipping? Or will it find the courage to turn inward, to invest in the needs of its own people, and create a sustainable path forward? That is the defining question of our time. Think about the extraordinary cost of maintaining global empire. Hundreds of billions of dollars every year poured into a military machine spread across more than 80 countries, while at home millions of Americans struggled to pay rent, to afford health care, to send their children to decent schools. The empire demands sacrifice, but the sacrifice is never shared equally. The wealthy elite benefits from global dominance. Corporations profit from foreign oil, foreign minerals, foreign markets. But the working class pays the price in their taxes, in their sons and daughters sent to wars, in the neglected social programs that could have given them security and dignity. This is the cruel paradox. An empire insists it makes its citizens strong, yet it often leaves them weaker, poorer, more insecure. And unless that contradiction is confronted, decline becomes not just possible, but inevitable. Here is the hook that should wake us up. Every empire in decline always imagines it can reverse its trajectory by doubling down. Rome thought one more war would restore its glory. Britain believed clinging to India would preserve its status. The Soviet Union convinced itself that matching the US, weapon for weapon, would keep it standing. Yet each of these actions only accelerated their fall. The same temptations before the United States today. In Venezuela, in Ukraine, in the South China Sea, the instinct is always the same. Show force, flex military muscle, intimidate rivals into submission. But what if those rivals are no longer intimidated? What if the world no longer accepts US dominance as unquestionable? That is precisely what China's rise represents. A world in which the US can no longer dictate unilaterally. And when an empire is confronted with that reality, it faces a choice: humility or hubris. The motivational truth here is that decline does not have to be catastrophic. It can be transformed into renewal if a society chooses wisely. The United States could decide that it is better to be one strong nation among many than to bankrupt itself, trying to be the sole superpower. It could redirect the enormous resources now spent on empire into rebuilding its own infrastructure, providing universal health care, erasing student debt, guaranteeing secure jobs and housing. Imagine the power of a society that measures its greatness, not by the size of its aircraft carriers, but by the health and well-being of its people. Imagine the moral authority that would come from leading in science, education, and cooperation rather than coercion and war. That is a vision within reach, but only if the people demand it. Let me put it plainly, history has given us a warning and an opportunity. The warning is clear: empires that refuse to adapt collapse under the weight of their own arrogance. The opportunity is just as clear by recognizing decline not as a failure, but as a chance for transformation. A nation can choose to write a different story. Will the U.S. be remembered as another empire that went down in flames, or as a society that learned from history and chose renewal over ruin? That answer will not come from politicians alone. It will come from the people, from their refusal to be dragged into one more imperial adventure, from their insistence that the wealth of this country be used not to dominate abroad, but to dignify life at home. That, my friends, is the real test before us, and it is one we cannot afford to ignore. When we look at Venezuela and the broader global stage, what stands out is not the presence of Chinese warships or military bases, but something far more subtle and perhaps even more powerful: the use of economic tools to achieve influence where guns once did the work. This should strike us as a profound shift in how power is expressed in the modern world. China is not landing troops in Caracas or threatening airstrikes. Instead, it is building roads, financing ports, purchasing oil, and providing technology. And here lies the hook on: in the 21st century, economic power can outshine military power. The old model of sending armies to conquer and occupy is giving way to a new model: winning loyalty, dependence, and partnership through trade and investment. The question we must ask ourselves is whether the United States, still clinging to military muscle as the centerpiece of its strategy, understands that the game has changed. Consider the consequences of this transformation. For decades, the United States has enforced its will in Latin America through coups, sanctions, and interventions. Yet despite all the bloodshed and destruction, the long-term results often slip away. Nations resent the intrusion, resistance movements grow, and the cost of occupation mount. By contrast, when China invests in Venezuela's oil infrastructure or extends credit to stabilize its economy, it is not simply extracting wealth. It is embedding itself into the lifeline of that society. The Venezuelan government, for all its troubles, sees in China an ally that does not dictate political terms with the barrel of a gun. Whether we agree with every aspect of China's strategy or not, the fact is undeniable: it represents a different kind of global influence. That is a wake-up call, because it shows that in today's world, real power is not just about who has the largest army, but who can offer the most sustainable future. Think about the symbolism of this for a moment. An empire like Rome could hold territory as long as its legions marched. Britain held India as long as its navy dominated the seas. The United States has long held sway by ensuring its military was never challenged. But what happens when another nation demonstrates that power can be secured not by threatening destruction, but by promising construction? Here is the hook in a world hungry for development, for jobs, for stability. People may choose the builder over the bomber. And when that choice becomes widespread, the entire balance of global power tilts. Now ask yourself, what does the United States offer Venezuela today? Sanctions that cripple its economy, isolation that deepens suffering, threats of intervention that provoke fear rather than trust. Meanwhile, China offers loans, infrastructure, and access to markets. Whose approach is more likely to win allies? Whose influence is more likely to endure? This is not to romanticize China or to ignore the strings that may be attached to its loans and investments, but it is to recognize that the methods it employs align with the basic needs of society's food, jobs, energy, stability. If power rests on the ability to shape lives, then economic tools are proving to be more effective than bombs. This is where the motivational lesson strikes home. For too long, we have been told that military might equals safety. That endless defense budgets are the price of security. But what if the true strength of a nation lies in its ability to uplift rather than to destroy? Imagine a United States that redirected its vast resources into building renewable energy at home and abroad, into developing medical technology, into solving global hunger. Imagine the moral authority and influence that would come not from fear of our weapons, but from admiration of our achievements. That is the choice before us cling to a fading military first model of empire or embrace the reality that, in this century, economic and social development shape the real battlefields of influence. History will remember which path we take. If we continue to believe that power is measured by aircraft carriers alone, we will watch our influence erode as other nations step in with offers that people actually need. But if we learn that true strength in this century is measured by the capacity to solve problems, create opportunities, and build partnerships, then decline can be reversed into renewal. The hook is simple yet profound. The future will belong not to those who intimidate the world, but to those who inspire it. When we speak about conflict, sanctions, and military clashes, the language of leaders and officials often makes it sound abstract, strategic, even clinical. But the reality underneath that language is anything but abstract. The true cost of these decisions is not borne by presidents, generals, or billionaires. It is carried by ordinary people. Every time a sanction is imposed, it is the worker, the shopkeeper, the mother, the student who feels its impact. Every time bombs fall, it is not the elite who scramble for shelter. It is the poor who lose their homes, their families, their futures. This is the truth that gets buried under speeches about national security or defending democracy. The ones who pay are the ones who had no say in the decisions that led to war. And here is the hook we must never lose sight of. If the costs are paid by the people, then the people must reclaim the power to decide whether these conflicts happen at all. Look at Venezuela as a living example. Years of sanctions have crushed its economy, restricted its access to basic medicines, blocked food imports, and devastated its currency. Did the political elite lose meals? Did the wealthy suddenly find themselves without access to luxury goods? No. It was the ordinary Venezuelan who stood in line for bread, who struggled to find antibiotics, who endured the chaos of inflation. Sanctions, we are told, are meant to target leaders, but in practice, they target the population. They weaken the very fabric of society while leaving elites largely untouched. And yet, these policies continue cloaked in the rhetoric of pressure and accountability. But accountability to whom? If the people most harmed had a voice in the matter, would they ever vote to starve themselves in order to make a political point? This is not unique to Venezuela. In Iraq, before the 2003 invasion, sanctions crippled the healthcare system so profoundly that countless children died from preventable diseases. In Afghanistan, decades of conflict left millions displaced while leaders negotiated safe passage out of the country. In Gaza, ordinary civilians live under the weight of blockades and bombardments, while the architects of policy live comfortably far from the suffering. Again and again, the pattern is the same. The rhetoric of war disguises the reality that ordinary lives are the currency spent for imperial ambitions. And that should enrage us because those lives are not expendable pawns in some geopolitical chess game. They are human beings, no different from you and me. Here lies the motivational spark. If ordinary people are the ones who bear the cost, then ordinary people must realize their collective power to resist. Imagine the potential of workers in the United States, in Venezuela, in China, standing together to say, no more wars fought in our name, no more sanctions that starve our children, no more wealth poured into weapons while we struggle to survive. Imagine how different the global order would look if the common interest of ordinary people came before the profits of defense contractors and oil companies. This is not fantasy. It is the lesson of every great movement in history. Change has always come when those who suffer most refuse to be silent. Think about the irony that while governments justify military action as defending freedom, those very actions rob people of their freedom. The freedom to live without hunger. The freedom to send their children to school safely. The freedom to hope for a better future. What kind of freedom is preserved when bombs destroy hospitals or when sanctions block life, saving medicine? Here is the hook we must hold on to. True freedom is not secured by missiles. It is secured by justice, by dignity, by the ability of people to live meaningful lives without fear of starvation or destruction. That is the freedom worth defending, and it is a freedom too often forgotten in the halls of power. The challenge before us is to strip away the illusions, to stop believing that wars are fought for noble causes when they are in fact fought for profit and power, to stop imagining that sanctions are a surgical tool when they are, in truth, a blunt weapon wielded against the weak. And most importantly, to recognize that the true agents of change are not presidents or generals, but people, workers, families, communities who refuse to pay the price any longer. When ordinary people grasp that their suffering is neither natural nor unavoidable, but the direct result of policies made by elites for their own gain, that realization can become the spark of resistance. And resistance, once awakened, can reshape the world. The most dangerous myth of our time is the belief that the trajectory of history is fixed, that the rivalry between great powers must inevitably end in war, that ordinary people are powerless to alter the course of events. That myth is not only false, it is paralyzing, and it serves the interests of those who profit from conflict. The truth is the opposite. History is filled with turning points where societies refuse to accept the path laid before them and chose a different future. And here is the hook. Right now, as the United States and China navigate their rivalry, the world has a choice. We can allow the 21st century to become a repeat of the destructive imperial rivalries of the past, or we can rewrite the story into one of cooperation, renewal, and shared progress. The outcome is not predetermined. It will depend on whether ordinary people demand something different. Think about what has already been normalized in our lives. Endless military spending as if it were the price of survival. Endless wars justified as the defense of democracy while democracy itself erodes at home. A political culture that insists confrontation with China is inevitable, that sanctions and threats are the only tools available, that the world must remain divided into winners and losers. These are not natural laws, they are political choices. And because they are choices, they can be unmade. That is the opening before us, and it is larger than many dare to imagine. What if, instead of preparing for decades of rivalry with China, the United States invested those trillions into healthcare, renewable energy, and education? What if, instead of starving Venezuela through sanctions, it engaged in cooperative development that addressed climate change and poverty? What if the measure of power was not how many weapons we possessed, but how many crises we solved. This is not Navi, it is practical, and it is urgent. The lesson of the last century is that confrontation between major powers produces only devastation. World War I destroyed Europe's empires. World War II I scarred the globe in ways we still live with today. The Cold War drained resources and left the world on the edge of nuclear annihilation for decades. And now we stand at the threshold of repeating that cycle unless we break it. The hook that should galvanize us is that breaking the cycle is within our reach. Multipolarity, for all the challenges it brings, creates the possibility of a world where no single nation dominates, but where nations must learn to coexist, to negotiate, to compromise. That possibility is revolutionary, and it is ours to seize if we choose. The motivational spark lies in recognizing that the people are not powerless observers of this process. Every movement that has shifted the course of history, from labor struggles that won the 8-hour day, to civil rights movements that dismantled segregation, to anti-war protests that forced withdrawals from Vietnam, was built by ordinary people who refused to accept the narrative handed down from above. Today, the narrative says rivalry with China is inevitable, that Venezuelans must suffer for their government's choices, that empire is necessary for security. But narratives can be challenged, and when enough voices rise to expose their contradictions, they crumble. That is where the real power of society lies. Imagine a century defined not by war, but by cooperation. Imagine US and Chinese scientists working together on climate change solutions instead of competing for dominance in fossil fuel markets. Imagine resources flowing into eradicating poverty rather than stockpiling weapons. Imagine international institutions redesigned not to serve the interests of the most powerful, but to elevate the needs of humanity as a whole. These possibilities are not fantasies. They are within the realm of what our resources, our technology, and our knowledge already allow. The obstacle is not capacity, it is will, and can be reshaped by people who refuse to accept decline into conflict as destiny. Here is the final hook that should stir us. The 21st century will be written, but not yet. The pages are still blank, the ink still wet. Whether those pages record another era of destruction or the beginning of a more humane world depends on choices we make now, in this generation, in this moment. If we choose silence, the story will be written for us by those who profit from war. If we choose resistance, if we insist on cooperation over confrontation, then we can transform what seems like inevitable rivalry into a new kind of history. One where justice, dignity, and peace replace domination, violence, and fear. The power to rewrite that story is not distant. It is ours, here and now, if we dare to seize it.